Hello everybody and welcome to this month's Specify and Practice Group call for CSI. So with that, I want to hand it over to David Lewis, as it looks like we might already have one question in the door. So David Lewis, over to you.
Well, thank you, Matt. This is Dave from southern New Jersey, and Lewis joining us from Music City.
Sunny downtown Nashville, Music City.
So,
and I talked David into because I was lazy to help him think of a new topic for this month. I talked him into doing a reprise of the presentation that David did at the convention that was sold out for the registration and was very intriguing and interesting. I attended it, and I thought a lot of other people would like to catch it who maybe didn't have that opportunity.
well, and yeah, he twisted my arm, folks, so here we are. Those of you that attended convention and actually sat through the presentation then, I invite you to please use the question and chat box. Let's get your ideas out there too. Criticize whatever I have to say, add your own thoughts. Let's get this going as a conversation. So what sorry, we're not offering AIA credits today, so we'll let that all go by.
Except self-reported.
Can you even do that anymore?
I don't know. I'm not AIA, so.
I don't think that's allowed anymore. Anyhow, so the kinds of things that we want to talk about today is using CSI uniformat as a structure, and I'm proposing that we use it as more than we do now. Right now it's used for preliminary project descriptions. So we want to look at how that may relate to BIM objects and how that BIM and uniformat both can work together. We want to look at matching specification content to BIM level of development, because we all know that all the information about every construction project is available on day one, so I don't know why we have to be concerned. We just document everything we know, and we should be done. Right, Lewis?
Right.
So, and the other thing, we just want to look at the relationships between BIM and uniformat and how we might be able to take advantage of both to our advantage. Okay. So the title of the program really is Evolving Specifications, moving from master format to uniformat, and maybe sacrilege to some, but we'll see. So master format, my interpretation, master format, if you read the introduction to the document, says that it's simply a list of numbers and titles. It describes work results and construction practices. It's typically going to be used for project manuals and detailed cost information. And we all know and love the 50 divisions and the 6-digit section numbers. The difficulty that I see in using master format, especially for anyone writing outline specs, master format really requires some detailed product information to be able to use it effectively. So those kinds of decisions are required as you're starting to use master format to make it really effective.
One thing about master format in contrast to uniformat is that master format is what is known as a documentary classification system, where the numbering originally had a certain level of sense, but the difference between the stuff that's in divisions 10 and 11 is pretty arbitrary. The other thing is that when you get to the level of a section, all the sections are at the same level. Now, some of them are very thick, but it's like a library where War and Peace is a lot thicker than the screw tape letters, but they're both books on a shelf, and master format gives you a number where to sort those books.
Yeah. One of the things I find master format does with the design disciplines, it tends to keep everybody in a silo, because you look at the distribution of the work, and the only one that really has any overlap is architectural and structural. Structural only because it falls into 3, 4, 5 and 6, and architectural spans that whole thing 1 to 14. And it tends to promote that silo approach rather than a collaborative approach, I believe. And I'm facing it right now, just trying to publish a project where I'm now trying to beg for all of the mechanical electrical sections so that I can even get the project out the door. Okay. Uniformat, on the other hand, is elements, and elements arranged by function. So the advantage here is that we can talk about an element without even knowing the design solution. So we can talk about an exterior wall. What does it have to do? What's its function? Do we really care early on in a project whether it's an insulated metal wall panel or a terracotta rain screen? We don't need to know that.
And the other thing about Uniformat, that in contrast to master format, is that it is what is known as an analytical classification system that has a definite hierarchy. So you can make statements at different levels of the outline. David and I actually first met when we were working on the revision for Uniformat back in 1996, 97?
Somewhere in there.
Somewhere in there.
So the advantage to Uniformat, because you don't need to know the design solution, you can start talking about design intent. What is that exterior wall supposed to do? What might it look like? We don't need to know that it's brick or block or terracotta. And we can also start talking about the owner's requirements. We can document some of those through the Uniformat process because owner's requirements are often performance-based. Now, unlike master format, what I see Uniformat doing is crossing disciplines much more. So this is just a chart that I put together to show on a particular project my interpretation of who was going to be the primary author of a particular Uniformat group and who might be a supplementary author that would be contributing information but not necessarily being the prime responsibility. And you can look down through here and you see virtually every one of these has multiple potential authors. Now this was for a particular project, so don't get too excited if you see something that might look out of whack to you personally. But it was just a way to try to demonstrate the collaborative effort that I think Uniformat helps to promote. Let me hit the right button and get going. So now I want to just explore some of these relationships that we're looking at between BIM, Uniformat, master format, where going from BIM, which is an element, it's a representation of the physical object that you're placing in the model, which is an assembly. Think about it, exterior wall. That becomes the object. When you try to describe that object in Uniformat, it's a one-to-one relationship because Uniformat is systems and assemblies. So it matches really quite well. If you take Uniformat and you go over to master format, it's a one-to-many. Let me just see if I can slide this back over here. So that exterior wall element could have numerous things in it that would apply to the exterior wall, but they're all going to be specified in individual sections. So trying to link a BIM object to master format is much more contentious. It takes a lot more skill.
And of course some of the objects, some of those constituent products are not actually modeled in BIM.
Correct. So, and if we take that one-to-many, going BIM to master format, what really happens is we're going one-to-many to a whole lot more. And so trying to make that direct link from BIM to master format could be nearly impossible, especially early on in a project. Okay. So if you're using Revit, you probably recognize this properties window. And this is for a particular exterior wall. I've highlighted some of it here in red. But what I'm trying to show is that with this exterior wall assembly, that we can start now defining the assembly code, which is Uniformat out of the box for Revit. These are filled in with a 5-digit, which is Uniformat, and it's followed by another 3 digits. Now this one was modified for this particular job, but Revit ships with an 8-digit number in there to define various exterior wall assemblies, and they do that for each one of the families. So if we can look at the BIM object, and Lewis started to say this earlier, that with Uniformat everything is hierarchical. If we can say it once at a high level, and in this case exterior vertical enclosures is a level 2, that would be B for shell or superstructure, and 20 for the exterior vertical enclosure, we can start talking about the overall element performance for the vertical enclosure. Think about schematic design, even go back to concept. What are you going to enter in that very first energy model for the exterior wall or the vertical enclosure? Maybe you'll have an overall U value. Maybe you'll have something like a glass to opaque percentage. That can be defined, and it can be defined here at this highest level. And you can begin to build the data that you're going to feed into the energy model and actually capture all of those decisions that you're making to be refined later. The refinement could come at the next level down, the level 3, exterior walls. So what kinds of performance do we have? What kinds of components might be in every one of the exterior walls? Regardless of how many you have, we can identify those once and then dive down even deeper to define each one of the individual walls. Is that hitting on the hierarchy, Lewis?
Definitely. We had a question from Michael McVitie. Our OmniClass Table 21 element constituents potentially strongly related to OmniClass Table 23 products.
My experience is no, because the products in Table 23 are really elemental types of products, and sometimes I think that they're going perhaps too deep for what we're trying to accomplish with construction specifications. My impression, Michael. I don't know if you have a different, but I'd like to hear if you do.
I think that Table 23 always struck me as being oriented more towards manufacturers than people who are trying to build buildings.
Right, and
from manufactured products.
I know I have it, and I'm not about to stop and go try to find it because I'll spend the rest of the time doing that. Okay, so here are the kinds of performance requirements I think that we could specify at a very high level for exterior walls, and just I'm going to stay on exterior walls as an example going through this whole presentation. So if you think about it, even at the highest level, at level 2, we may be able to start talking about some of these performance requirements.
Right. If you're doing a downtown building, you certainly need to think about which walls being adjacent to other buildings or too close to other buildings may require a fire exterior wall requiring a fire rating, and so you can identify those up front so that everybody knows that and can design to that datum. Right.
Now, this next one is point that I want to try to make is my impression dealing with my clients and the architects that I'm out there actually trying to sell services to. What I hear most architects tell me is that they want the BIM data to remain generic, and they want it to remain generic for as long as is possible. Now they're telling me that, I believe, and this is my opinion, that they're trying to leave open decision options. So they don't want to take that exterior wall object in the model and identify it as brick and block insulated cavity wall on day one when they create the model. What they want to do is be able to identify it as exterior wall, and at some point, maybe the day before we go to print for bid, that they will decide that that's an exterior insulated brick and block cavity wall.
We've had some discussions here about identifying, Uniformat has a number for basic exterior wall construction where you could put in the steel studs, the bat insulation, the sheathing, the air barrier that would be common behind 2 or 3 or more types of cladding. You might have masonry veneer over that basic wall construction. You might have ACM. You might have fiber cement, all kinds of things hung on that basic wall construction. And
Correct.
So that could be nailed down, and that also might eliminate some duplication in the text in the descriptions.
Right. So my reaction to the architects that I'm talking to is I'm saying, fine, you stay generic in the model. I'm happy with that. I can take that exterior wall object and I can describe the performance, I can describe the design requirements, and at some point when you finally decide what that exterior wall is, when you come up with the designed solution, then I can talk about the components that go into that wall, and I can start assigning the attributes of those components so that you can still remain generic in the model if you wish, because the data is captured elsewhere. So looking at that exterior wall, staying on that, the components that I might be looking at, here they are, the description of the exterior wall. Once I know what those are, now I can begin to look at the master format link. You know, where would they be specified if we were using master format at this point? I can identify those within the project description and can actually sort and deal with this information to be able to extract information to help make that link, and I'll show you some of those as we get toward the end. But the link then, I am suggesting, this is the sacrilege part, that master format specs may end up tending toward a standard, that we might be able to identify specific products or specific materials that we could write a standard spec that would virtually remain unchanged project to project, because in this case we have face brick, we know we're going to have mortar, we know we're going to have ties, all of the components that go into putting that face brick on a cavity wall, we could write that and it could virtually stay unchanged regardless.
David?
Yes.
Would you see an advantage to having separate, very, very small spec sections, like one page and a half for the face brick, a separate section for mortar, separate section for the ties, and separate section for flashing and so forth?
We could.
And then that way you could have multiple sections for different kinds of brick or different kinds of flashing, and then you just edit by picking the right section.
Perhaps, or referring to the right section.
Yeah, that's right.
Because what I am trying to suggest is that with the element description, that we can deal with the entire element here. We can deal with the interfaces. We can deal with the connections from one element to the next, but we don't have to deal with the individual product. That we can deal with that through master format separately and more as a standard. And I think that this tree that I'm going to show you is really why that this is all working. Because master format, if we look at the individual phases, we're developing discrete data, an outline spec supposedly at a DD phase, construction spec during CD phase, and we're not able to allow that data really to grow through the design process as the data is developed. Where with uniformat, it's expandable. You write what you know when you know it, and you let it expand as the data grows. So you're never really stopping, you're just continuing to refine, add, develop, just as the design does. Now the only thing I would like to say is that, hey, by the time we get to CD phase, you see the largest amount there. We all know that all the design decisions are supposed to be done when, Lewis?
At the end of DD phase, and that's even a contractual obligation for IDP projects.
So if we can try to push that, great, but practicality says that a lot of design decisions are still happening during CD phase. So uniformat can continue to accommodate that rather than being discrete information developed at a point in time.
Hold off just David. A couple of comments. One is we had a question what IDP, I misspoke, I meant IPD, Integrated Project Delivery. And then Ken Chappell is suggesting we're making this excessively complicated.
Perhaps, Ken, bear with me. Let me get to that. I think there's the punchline at the end, and I'm hoping that would help alleviate the complication. All right. So bear with me. If you still think that, I would love to know by the time we get to the end.
Actually, and of course, Ken, what we're trying to do here is explore what things are going to be like in the future. What are some of the possibilities? Because we all know that, frankly, we just can't keep writing specs with word processors in the traditional fashion. That's just not going to go on. It'll work for a few years, but at some point we're going to have to make some major changes. And let's go to let's see what David's got up his sleeve.
Okay, so here my interpretation of what you might be doing with an exterior wall in BIM. So schematic design, you're going to place something, it's a wall. That's about as much as you know. It's 2 lines, it's taking up volume. 2 lines. It's a volume surrounding the building exterior. DD phase, you might decide it's a cavity wall. CD phase, it's a brick veneer. So SD phase, if you're placing an object in BIM, it might look simply this. It's an inside and an outside taking up volume. By the time you get to CD phase, it might be something like this. But the architects, the designers, when they're trying to start the model, are not ready to make these decisions to be able to set this kind of detail at the outset of the design. And that's why I'm proposing what I am, to allow them flexibility to be able to get into CD without having to make those decisions. So if we look at how Uniformat can support it, during SD we can set the performance and the design requirements. During DD we can start to list those major components. And during CD we can identify every component that goes in there and all of the intersections from one element to the next. In master format, because of the discrete information, you realize what's happening in outline, where we may only have major components identified, we're already trying to ask for that detailed product information to know what to include in the outline spec, and it may not be available. So I'm suggesting on almost every project that I'm writing now that we completely eliminate outline spec and substitute an elemental description in its place, because I think it's a better end result, a better document for the owner.
And ultimately, people don't like to write outline specs anyway because it's a throwaway document. It's
typically. Let me what I want to do is talk a little bit.
Outline specs in the traditional sense of the abbreviated master format.
Yeah.
Specs.
I want to talk a little bit about budget and how these two different systems are working. So with Uniformat, Uniformat was actually first developed by estimators, and there was a reason for that. It was a costs based upon an entire building assembly, so that you could make value judgments early on in design to know where you're buying your best value. Master format is cost reporting. It goes to the detailed quantity takeoff. This is not really meant for cost analysis. So trying to get that true analysis early on that you might need to make those important design decisions may be a whole lot more difficult if the estimate is master format based. So if you think about it, Uniformat, if it's cost analysis by element, you can look at, say, exterior wall 1 and that compare it directly to exterior wall 2, and you can compare those costs. Where master format, exterior wall 1 might have pieces of all of this, exterior wall might have pieces of something entirely different. So how are you making those comparisons? If your estimate report that you get just lumps masonry into one line item, how do you pull those parts and pieces apart to be able to do a rational comparison of both exterior walls? It's much more difficult. So I look at Uniformat as being a really proactive document during the design process, while master format is much more reactive. All right, Ken, here I hope is where we can make a good point for you. So what I'm looking at is the current process is Uniformat and master format, PPDs early on in the design process, outline spec and construction spec. So right now we're looking at different purposes at different times during the progression of the design project. What I'm thinking is that we may want to look at something more like this, where Uniformat is used throughout the life cycle of the project. We start with an elemental description during the early design phases. As it evolves, we talk about Uniformat as a system specification, and as we move through construction into the building operation, that it really becomes an asset description for the owner, so that he has documentation that he can take forward to help him actually own and operate the building. I'm suggesting that master format still has a place, at least for the moment, that we can talk about master format being the material and product specs to support the system specification offered by Uniformat, and that group, Uniformat system spec and master format material and product spec, actually becomes the construction documents. Okay, so I'm trying to go through this somewhat quickly in hopes that we do have time for comments, questions, alternative opinions. So I'm asking everybody as specifiers to rethink how they're actually producing documents. let's look for some industry standardization, but let's support that standardization with project customization that's needed to adapt the standardized practices to a particular project. So if we're looking at construction documents, can we look at BIM as being the graphics? Can we look at Uniformat being the performance for building systems, and Master Format being the description of those materials and products? And I believe if we can use each one of these documents for its best purpose, that we may end up with a better set of construction documents in the end. Radical, perhaps, but I'm asking you to at least have an open enough mind to think about the possibilities, whether, because I'm not suggesting a definitive way to accomplish all of this. I'm asking for the industry to begin thinking about the possibilities.
Dave Metzger has a comment. He says that, of course, Master Format is much more than only a material and product spec. It is also a spec for administrative requirements and processes, and for installation requirements that are not accommodated by Uniformat.
I would agree. And today I would agree with you, Dave. I think that we haven't really considered how Uniformat can actually be used as a contract document. And I believe once we do start looking at it, we may find creative ways that it can accommodate some of the things that you're mentioning that Master Format provides today.
Stephen Nash asks, why not use OmniClass Table 23 instead of Master Format? We did talk about that a little bit for the products, and he thinks that might be a better tie-in to BIM.
It may very well be, Stephen, and I'm trying to, I didn't want to go off the deep end. I thought if I did that, I might not even be presenting at Construct. I didn't want to suggest we throw away Master Format. After all, we are talking about CSI's flagship document,
for which they make a lot of money by licensing it to ARCAT and MasterSpec and a number of different for-profit organizations.
Yeah, and I think that what I'm trying to propose is also radical enough that will it happen tomorrow? No. Might it happen in 10 years? Perhaps. It might be a progression to get there, and we'll shake the trees and see what falls out and see what's good, see what's bad, and adjust as we go. Ultimately, maybe Master Format does disappear. Maybe it is replaced by OmniClass. But unless we begin thinking about this and trying it, I don't know that we'll be able to find out.
Steve Groth asks if you've actually experimented with doing a project this way.
We're getting there. And Steve, I'll tell you that the very first time that I presented the whole concept of a Uniformat description was in 1998, and I had the blessing of having the owner in the project team meeting. And after I made my pitch to the design team, the reaction was somewhat ho-hum. The owner stood up in the meeting with probably about 30 people in the room, the entire design team, and said, we're doing this. And he says, we're maintaining this document start to finish through construction, because he saw it as a very valuable QA tool. He saw it as a way for the design team to document what they said they were going to do, and to be able to use the result to go back and check the construction documents to find out if they actually did what they said they were going to do. He also found that he was going to be able to use it. In this case, it was a, as I remember, it was a timeshare kind of a property, and he was going to use it as a sales tool to actually be able to sell the timeshares, to be able to explain to the buyers what they were getting. So I think the possibility for Uniformat is just only the tip of it has really been explored so far. Okay.
To get back to using the master format, so what you might be envisioning is that we have a bunch of very short standardized specs, and let's just take flashing for example, and you have maybe 2 different types that you want to use for different purposes, and so in that spec section it would only list, do you want product data or not? That's a yes no question. There's certainly no shop drawings for it. You just list the product, and for many products the execution is really comply with the manufacturer's recommendations. There's, other than saying hang it straight and screw it tight, beat to fit and paint to match, there's a lot of the execution is just simply not needed. And so what we're talking about is using Uniformat as an organizational tool to call in and see that viewing this thing as an electronic document with actual hyperlinks, so that when you're looking at the description of exterior wall type 3 and it comes to the line for the flashing, you click on that and it calls it up and you say, oh, that's what they want.
That's a definite possibility. So you're one step ahead of me, I think.
No, I'm usually one step behind you, brother.
Oh, no, yeah. You're pressing ahead. So what I'm trying to suggest is under Uniformat, what we're really doing is we're taking some of the could be repetitive information, especially when it relates to performance for the assembly, and combining it, gathering it all up into one place, specify it under each assembly, then describe the assembly with the interfaces and all the components. And if we need to actually then use Uniformat to go back and distribute that detail back to master format.
Mike McVitie has the comment, elements are the only classification that threads through together through every phase, and that's what your client saw.
And I think you're absolutely right, Michael. The advantage too that I see when I go in to try to talk to architects, especially starting an outline spec, because I'm following master format, I want to talk about brick and block, and as soon as I try to talk about brick and block, they want to talk about exterior wall. And it doesn't take long for that conversation to devolve from product to assembly. And then we usually finish the meeting talking only assemblies. And I'll sort the data out later because it's easier to do that. That's how the architects are thinking. It's how they can best describe the facility. And the owners can understand it actually better when it's in an elemental description. So one of the things I wanted to share with you today as we're finishing up, and then we can continue the conversation, is here's an example of something that I'm experimenting with where I started this exterior wall assembly as a elemental description. The left-hand column with the dots and X's and such is a selection column. The plus signs over on the left, if you're not familiar with Excel's outline feature, is essentially indicating there's hidden lines in between each of the ones that are shown. So what I would do is start with something like this to show go down and say, okay, I want to include the design description. I'll mark that with my green dot. I may have something to say about basis design, so I'll mark that with the question mark, and the alternatives in the history of that particular element I don't expect to include. So I'll mark that with the red X. So if I expand the one level of this to show you the kinds of things that I'm looking at, and I'm doing this in Excel because as a proof of concept that I think that this can work. I've shown that it actually can work in Excel, and now I think it's a matter of taking this result and moving it to a different platform that's a little bit more friendly, especially for presentation, because Excel doesn't do a great job of presenting text. And there's some options available. So now this green dot column becomes a selection column. We can build a master. We can add things in as we write each elemental description, and now it becomes part of the master for easy selection as we're going forward on additional projects. And the text is, of course, all editable, so it really doesn't matter, but we can try to build where we think it would be appropriate. I go back here and hit the right button again. So then, expanding down into the component level, now I've added a column where we start to show where the link is to master format. And this can be set up in advance as part of the master. It can be adjusted for an individual project. And these, like Lewis was hinting at earlier, could turn into the hyperlinks out to that standardized or somewhat standardized master format section. So you want to know about backup masonry, you click 04-2000 and you open up the section, and away you go. So you don't have to go directly from a BIM object out to a masonry spec section. You go from that BIM object one-to-one to an elemental description, and let the elemental description handle the linking farther down the chain. By using the master format section numbers as part of the components, now I can extract information, and this is using one of the Excel features called pivot table, that it'll extract individual instances of each item. So if backup framing occurred in multiple exterior wall assemblies, it would extract it only once and tell you that it belongs in section 05-4000 and give you the basic description that was used in the elemental description. Depending upon how you have this set up, it can also report which one of the elements was actually calling for that backup framing. So that brings us back to the conclusion. I'm asking you to rethink how we're producing construction documents and what role Uniformat may very well be able to play in that process.
I think it's obvious from Dave's presentation that what I said earlier about us not writing individual documents with word processors anymore, that sooner or later we've got to really get serious about producing information with a database system that obviously would link these two sets of information. And I think eSpecs has gone a certain distance that way, although they don't have any provisions for a preliminary project description yet. But we could certainly, we have to envision it before somebody can write it.
Right. So I would love to leave it open for discussion here. I think we've covered many of the questions, have we not?
Yes, actually Joel Nemi had one before you even started speaking, which is that I've been holding off until the appropriate time. He says Uniformat is a great way to organize standard detail collections too, and note that Revit uses it. But what about those owners who are still locked into master format editions from the past century? Joel, just this year, I worked with a client who that does they own food stores, grocery stores, and we are working with them on a number of stores to meet their prototype, which is shared. A couple of other firms are doing them too, and so I met with the representatives of the other firm to hammer out standardized specifications, and that owner had a very strong preference for using the 16 division organization and 5-digit spec section numbering. So that is a real life situation. So what are you going to do about it, David?
Well, it's not going away anytime soon. I will admit that I am still writing those as well. But if I go back, see if I can get this to cooperate. Come on, no, the other way. Thank you. If I go back here and say, these master format numbers, I don't care what they are. They can be 5-digit, they can be 6-digit, they can be 37-digit, doesn't really matter. Some future, it could be Omni class. We could have multiple columns, one for each. 95, 04, pardon me, 14, and Omni class. So all of them could be accommodated, and if you wanted to bother to keep all of them current, maybe in some cases we would need to.
If we want to have some ideas about how to write those standardized super short, super narrow spec sections, all we have to do is ask old Sheldon Wolf to stick up his hand and throw his oar into this lake.
So,
what do you think, Sheldon?
Non-committal. Thanks for that answer, Sheldon. You bet. I love it. All right. So now, anybody that wants a copy of this, let me get back to... if you go to Prezi, Prezi.com, and you search for evolving specifications, you're going to find it. And feel free to use it to whatever you like, criticize it, leave a comment if you would. You can actually do that on the Prezi site. And maybe we get this discussion started and keep rolling.
On the tweets, David, Eric Lucier takes us to task for bugging the Chancellor of the Fellows, and with his and has a laugh indicated. But Eric, I do have special privilege because I am secretary of the College of Fellows, so I am allowed to harass the Chancellor. Greta and Sheldon does in fact say, you bet, that he'll be happy to help people write those super short, super narrow spec sections, because he kind of thinks that way already. Greta Eckhart says, this spreadsheet is great. I'm thinking that if properly used, such a spreadsheet could have an impact on the design process itself, not just documentation. And yes, Greta, that's exactly what we're trying to think about, is that the documentation are like snapshots taken at different times during the development of the information, and so the information is put out in a way that it is a means of communicating amongst the design team. Not only with external consultants, but in my own case, at my firm, some of our larger projects, we have architects from 3 or 4 of our offices working on the same project, and it would be good for them to be able to access all of the project decisions that have been made about the assemblies in one location and have that information at their fingertips.
Well, and I'd like to say too, Greta, that the spreadsheet was an attempt, and a first attempt, proof of concept. I don't expect this kind of information to remain in a spreadsheet, because when we started the discussion, we were talking about uniformat approaches being a more collaborative approach, that I picture this ultimately as a web-based service of some sort, where you could have multiple users at the same time actually editing the elemental description. And that way it would promote the collaboration even better, and we could have real-time access to current information, everybody on the team. Because if we can't promote the real-time collaboration, we're still stuck in these sort of silo approaches. And going forward with BIM and trying to coordinate BIM and specifications, it's almost a dead end. That we need to look beyond that to see how we can make it more collaborative. And Jim, I see your question about Prezi. No, you do not need an account. You just go to Prezi.com and you'll see a search window, a search box. I'll see if I can get the example and show you. Okay, and Louis, you want to take Dave's question? Dave Metzger?
Oh, okay, yes. The exterior wall is one of the more complex systems in a building, and you have convinced this skeptical specifier of the advantages of Uniformat to describe these systems. But there are many components of a project that are not system-based. I'm thinking in particular of much of Divisions 6, 9, 10, 11, 12, 14. Are the advantages of using Uniformat instead of master format for these as obvious? Well, the first thing, Dave, I think is Dave S. is not saying we do one instead of the other. It's both together, and using Uniformat more as a master document to organize the master format information. But you're absolutely right. When David and I were working on the Uniformat revisions back in the 90s, mid-90s, more rigorously elemental, because a couple of the elements, E and F, are more like just alternate versions of Divisions 10 and 11, to be quite frank. On the other hand, an elevatoring system can easily be broken down, because occasionally, and even in master format type specs, I have written a separate section for elevator car finishes, where you want a custom finish, and sometimes it's just easier to write that as a separate section. So there are possibilities, and yeah, that's one of the limitations, and that's one of the things that needs to be thought through.
Yeah, and one of the points there, Dave, I think is that I'm currently looking at how we make that connection between BIM and the specifications. So the kinds of things that you're talking about may not always be modeled in BIM, and one of the other aspects, and I haven't explored how this may actually work with what I'm proposing here with Uniformat, but I try to talk to our architects that there are two places where you can actually significantly help the specification documentation process. One is with the objects, if we can identify them correctly, even if we get nothing more than the Uniformat number assigned to the object. And the other place is in rooms or spaces, because I always use the example of the projection screen. None of my clients will model a projection screen. None of them. And the reaction is, when I try to use an e-specs to do the project spec, the reaction is, we need it, just specify it. We're not modeling it. But they could indicate in the room or space in conference room that conference rooms require projection screens. And then from that information, simply with the room, we could generate the link back out to uniformat or potentially to master format to know that projection screens required, even if they're not modeling it.
Mike McVitie has a comment, although he left before I could read it. Mike, by the way, for some of you who may not know him, was chair of the technical committee for a while. He says elements, products, and parameters are information-based. Master format and section format are much more document-based. This presentation relates more directly to the idea of BIM, modeling graphics objects and specification together in a relation database is what we need to demand. Agreed. Joel Nemi says, follow-up to this session not needed, but actually this approach could totally get old school owners off the fence. In a recent project meeting at DD stage, I pointed out that the detailed cost estimate didn't have any real help for making decisions. Uniformat-based elements are so much better for that. For another school district, I urged them to include in their standard specs a few simple tables of interior finishes for elementary, middle, and high schools. They do vary. For whatever reason, they preferred to stick with 16 divisions and have used the text in the sections saying, use this for elementaries or not for high schools. And sometimes it may take waiting for the old stick in the mud to retire or go elsewhere, because many times their coworkers see the advantage but aren't empowered or allowed to make the change. And that's absolutely true, Joel.
And Joel, I would just like to add to your comment about the estimating, because so many times we see in projects, we get through a design stage, the estimate's prepared, and then the very next step is VE. Well, we all know VE is never true VE. It's purely cost-cutting to get to a budget number. But if you do that without the benefit of looking at the assembly and doing the true cost analysis, as opposed to the cost reporting under master format, you may lose sight that, yes, you cut the cost, but you also cut performance. And that often gets lost in that equation. And if we're talking about the projects under a uniformat system and looking at the elements and have that performance already documented as part of the description, now we can begin to evaluate performance as well as cost.
So in that sense, the elemental description is kind of an extension of the program, but dealing with the physical makeup of the building rather than just the spatial requirements.
Yes.
We have a couple of quick comments, and then we are just right after the hour. Jim Spinall says, back in the old days, I embedded spec section numbers and brief descriptions in our standard CAD details. That first iteration allowed me to develop a BOM and acted as a basis for the TOC. Worked well in a rudimentary way back then. Revit and other CAD spec software has come a long way since. Louis Schlatter comments, another reason for the resistance to 50 divisions happens when internal budgets and accounting and taxes are tied to the old 16 divisions. Ooh, I had never thought of that, Louise, but you're right. That is definitely, yes, that is a powerful force against change. Well, we want to thank everyone for your comments today and the participation. I hope that this has given you some ideas to think over and chew over, and who knows, we might revisit this subject. On the issue of subjects for our discussions, these monthly discussions, Robert Bowman who is not able to be with us today, sent us a list of 6 or 7 ideas, and so we would like you to keep those cards and letters coming in, friends and neighbors, so that we can, be responsive to what is bugging you and what you'd like to have threshed out. We want this to be your show, and so we look forward to hearing from you. David?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lewis, and thanks you to everyone who joined us today. I really appreciate that.